Hi, welcome back to Game Geeks. I'm your host, Kurt Wiegel. Today's episode, Iron Gauntlets. This is a fantasy role-playing game that takes some real diversions from standard fantasy such as D20 and puts an entirely new spin on the engine, how to present the book, and how the game itself works. I'm going to say up front, it's a really interesting fantasy game. One of the things I was realizing as I was reading through it, though, is I was thinking, that's not how druids work, or, that's not how magic works. This is not at all like D&D. And then it occurred to me that, well, I'm kind of looking for an alternative to Dungeons & Dragons. Why don't I give other things a chance? That's more of my personal couch time with my therapist than having to do with the game. So let's get right into this now, shall we? Iron Gauntlets is it's a game that allows you to use a couple different engines. It gives you a couple different options for how to actually roll the dice in this. The standard presentation of the characters is you have a series of attributes, which are your standard role-playing attributes. Then you have skills. Okay, the mechanic for this that you look for is it's a dice pool game, but it's kind of neat. What you do is you roll a number of dice for any skill, be it reading a book or translating a book, swinging a sword, climbing a wall, seducing the wench, whatever. You roll a series of dice based on the appropriate attribute. Now you have certain modifiers, certain flares, certain other things that can help you by adding one or more dice to that pool. The target number you look for is your skill. So let's say whatever you're trying to do is governed by the attribute 6. You roll 6 dice. You have a skill of 4. You want to get a 1, 2, 3, or 4. Every time you get one of those, it's a success. You roll 10-sided die. It's a success. Congratulations. Bearing that in mind, it's actually quite simple to play this because you don't have to worry about shifting target numbers. The only thing that really changes is how many successes you need to pull something off. And even that is fairly straightforward, and your game master knows. One of the things that sets this apart from other fantasy games is the way the magic works. There is crafting, which is essentially your standard wizardry, altering reality. Divinity, which is your clerical power, your divine. Totem, connection to the spirit world. And essence, or sort of like a psychic or biokinesis type power. That all works on the same basic principles. The engine's the same. What really changes is how you can use them and the flavor of it. So really everything is unified very nicely into a single type of how you roll the dice. Also included in this is a really nice broad strokes fantasy world it's enough there that you can work with and that you can start play there in the Kingdom of Tyr. Or you can ignore it and make your own, or you can carve out a region of the world and make it your own as well. It's enough generality that it works very nicely. Now, there have been a few supplements for this. There's a player's companion, and there's also an alternative setting, Steampunk Musha, which is a really interesting hybrid fantasy setting. We're seeing a lot of hybrid fantasy settings these days. We're seeing Eberron, which is really pulp fantasy. We're seeing Midnight, which is like a horror fantasy, and those have been around for a while. This is kind of cool. This is a combination of Victorian era role-playing, Oriental role-playing, and fantasy. So you've got basically Shanghai cowboys that have showed the firearms, and they're now taking over things. They're samurai. You've got kabuki magic, which is kind of interesting. So it comes a complete different setting, a different set of races, some magic that's a little bit different, but again, it still follows that nice unified mechanic. This is currently going out of print. Now, that means that they're not printing any more hard copies of this, but you can still get PDFs of these books wherever fine PDFs are sold. I recommend looking at drivethroughrpg.com or rpgnow.com to start looking for how you get PDFs of these. This is made by PIG, Politically Incorrect Games. It's gone through a series of different names, but basically look for PIG, piggames.net. You can find where you can get the PDFs of these. If you want a fantasy game that's a little bit different, and actually it's more than a little bit different, it's quite different from your standard Dungeons & Dragons fantasy, I think the system is easier to learn, and I think that once you get the handle on this, you'll just be able to rock and roll with this very easily because there's not a whole lot of changes or modifications that get thrown at you. I recommend this if you're looking for a fantasy alternative to Dungeons & Dragons, especially if you're a bit leery about some of the things you hear about 4th edition coming out in 2008. So, for Game Geeks, I'm your host, Kurt Wiegel. Good day and good gaming.